Let's transition to our trending topic, which is the psychology of fetishes. All right, so I want to ask this question before we dive in. We have planning meetings every month, and we come up with this. Why did we, Emma Kate was not there. Why did we decide to come up with, why are we talking about this topic?
All of our producer and sound engineer is Sean Beck and Mariel Butler. They're the ones that wanted us to do this.
Yeah, we were like, please, we don't want to talk about it. But it was
and
just
they're like,
Mariel
no,
and
this
Sean.
is what the young people are talking about.
You must talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And so we were powerless in the face of their heavy
They're probably
influence.
back there laughing their you-know-what's off that we're here trying to have a serious conversations about fetishes.
Yep.
I didn't know if there was like a news story or something, but I was like, wow, that is pretty random.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. She's like, I leave to get married and go on my honeymoon, and this is the topic I come back to.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You haven't been back on the podcast since your honeymoon. So congratulations, by the way.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll talk about that another time. But
thank you. The healthy boundary.
Healthy boundaries.
Why don't we just merge the two subjects right here?
Moving along now. I feel
so
uncomfortable
let's
with
start
that
with some definitions. All right. So how would we define, sometimes in popular culture, we talk about fetishes as something that people are interested in. Like, oh, she's got a fetish for Real Housewives of the, whatever. They misuse the word. So can someone start with what is a fetish in the technical sense? Emma Kate, you want to take a stab at that?
I do not. Thank you, though.
Okay.
I think Frank has
This is one of Jonathan Hedderly's specialties.
All right, Jonathan, you're up.
I think you're fetish profiling me. I mean, what we're essentially talking about here is experiences, objects, or situations that are strongly associated with arousal. And usually it kind of overlaps into sexual arousal. So when people talk about fetishes from a non-sexual, it's like they're so excited. There's a lot of anticipatory build up towards that. It gets them excited. There's adrenaline. But when we're talking about sexual fetishes, it's something that you normally wouldn't on its own associate with sexual activities. But there is this overlapping arousal and stimulation that they associate with sex, or oftentimes sometimes becomes compulsive and necessary to activate sexual arousal.
Right.
So it might be someone might have a fetish about shoes, or a fetish about certain types of clothing, or certain that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was going to add feet. That's a common one because a lot of the brain research out there talks about, so you take this neutral stimulus like a foot. That's not really exciting for most of us.
Speak for yourself.
I know, right? But so that neutral stimulus somehow gets paired with arousal, and then your brain over time creates an association with, oh, here's the foot. I am excited now. And at the same time, there's also other interesting research that I don't know a ton about, but I started looking at did you guys know that the foot is actually near the region of the brain responsible for the genitalia? And there's so there's supposed to be, that might be why there's weird wiring issues within the brain that could result in people having kind of unique sexual interests.
Well, maybe that's like tickling.
Maybe. I don't know. That could be a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank, when I tickled you, it was just a tickle.
Yeah,
okay?
It was just a tickle.
Okay.
So it seems like in looking at all these fetishes, it's I've never seen so many. I mean, people are doing some crazy stuff. There's this guy, James Joyce, who wrote, Ulysses?
Oh, my gosh.
So we're doing some modern research here, right?
No, but
there was a guy named Moses. You wouldn't believe what he was into.
This stuff was around before the internet. And
most things were around before the internet.
The internet did not create fetishes, Frank.
He was obsessed with his wife flatulating into his mouth.
No.
That was his thing. That seems horrifying. Horrifying.
And that is the contribution that Frank Gaskell will have in today's podcast episode.
And there's another dude that would go into alleys.
Let's not use them all
so
up
let's
at
set
once.
a boundary for our listeners. When you set boundaries, and this is important when you're in an intimate relationship.
These are historical
being firm and calm and saying, Frank, when I hear discussions about farting in someone's mouth, I feel uncomfortable. I would like to change the topic, please.
But in the era of sex positivity,
So Hetterly.
Don't say but when we're talking about fetishes.
within a loving relationship, and they're both consenting adults,
There.
and he's a famous author,
I'll
she
get
should
to that.
eat more beans.
See, we could get some value out of your commentary there when you say if you're in a healthy, loving relationship,
That
people
was
are in
assumed.
agreement. Well, not everybody knows everything about
well,
this.
now we know because she was into it,
Mm-hmm.
and he wrote letters to her about it.
Yeah, people want to trust and people want to, there's a lot of fear of losing control. And it's important to let somebody know that they are safe. And if that is something that somebody is interested in,
When you're in that,
I feel like we've like
Go for
hijacked a love hotline here between
you're-
the two of them.
yeah.
when you're into that kind of a
Yeah.
fetish, you do not want to lose control.
All right, I'm gonna hijack
Okay,
it
keep
back.
going.
Thank you,
Jonathan,
Dave.
go ahead. You were going to say
With
something.
what?
Oh, I thought you had something to add. Dave.
No, I was just like, Dave, let's steer the ship back.
All right, I'm steering it back. Here we go. So, this first of all, I think we would agree that most fetishes, true fetishes, are not normative, meaning like most people don't do a particular one particular fetish. That being said, there's a whole range of things that people do that turn them on sexually. So my question is, do you feel like fetishes are positive, negative, neither, or depends? Like, how would you think about this psychologically? Is this something that you'd be like, oh, this person has a fetish? Let's say, let's just take a very benign thing, a shoe fetish. Is that just a benign thing? Is that the sign of something that is unhealthy? Is it a healthy thing? Like, what's a good way to think about that kind of fetish? Emma Kate?
Well, I guess whenever these sorts of things come up, I always think about the nature of thoughts and how a thought is simply a thought, but your thinking really charges your emotions. And so if you are feeling aroused or excited, then you are going to create that association between things. At the same time, though, the emotion is what's going to feed the thought too. And so if it's just kind of this dualistic, it's a cycle where over time you might develop an interest that would maybe be socially deviant. But even then, that changes over time because society is constantly perpetuating certain norms for beauty and what is acceptable and what isn't. And so things are going to just evolve because, there's a difference too between pleasure and joy. And like, I think it's just interesting. I would be curious. I didn't do enough research, obviously, but to go back in time and say, okay, well, what would be quote unquote attractive or more sexually provocative? You even think back to the 20s when flappers came around and how risque that was, and or showing your ankles at one point. So I think there is a broader cultural piece that has to be considered.
I think it very much depends. I think it depends on where is this fetish coming out of. Is it coming out of a trauma? Is it perpetuating a trauma? Does it violate somebody's, personal, I don't know, personal rights, but does it violate somebody? And you'd say, okay, so somebody has a foot fetish, but it's a kid who's going into his sister's closet to get her shoes versus, hey, I can't say this out loud. Hey, Mom, please buy me my own shoes. But I think it has to do, again, with the relationship and whether it's trusting, healthy, and okay for both parties.
Yeah, you brought up something that I think for me is a key component, is that if somebody is getting some type of sexual pleasure or gratification through non-sexual means, but involves somebody else, I do not think it's appropriate for that other person not to be aware that whatever they are doing, like tickling or other stuff like that, or a foot fetish, that they are not aware that their behavior is fueling someone else's sexual gratification. So part of sex positivity that we talked about is consent and people really being fully aware of the impact that they present in somebody else's sexual expression and sexual freedom. I tend to think of it is very much a depend. It just depends. It depends on if another person is involved. A lot of times I think about my work with addiction and substance abuse, that it's not just like how many beers is too much. It's like, well, what's the impact it's having on all these other aspects of your life? People say, like, I don't get drunk every night, so I don't have a drinking problem. And I say, well, you're here with your wife and you guys are arguing about this. So you have a drinking problem because it's creating a problem in your relationship around your drinking. And so when you think about fetishes, it's how accepting and tolerant is the other people that you may have a committed relationship to. I think one of the things that our society is, I don't think it's struggling, but it's adjusting, is the separation of sex apart from love and intimacy. That some people see those intrinsically connected and other people don't. And so that, I think, is an interesting conversation about the whole changing landscape of sex in our culture.
So you guys have mentioned, and I think you're in agreement, that the theme of as long as it, or certainly if it involves someone else, the other person has to be informed, consenting, aware of it, comfortable with all that kind of stuff. But let me push it a little bit. What if it is a fetish for someone that involves them being degraded or hurt, and it's their choice, but they're being either emotionally or physically or in some way harmed, degraded by this fetish because it turns them on? Would you guys have an opinion psychologically about that? Does that seem like it's just a neutral or okay thing, or is that something that's potentially unhealthy?
I feel like it's their choice. I mean, I don't feel like it's my right to say you should or shouldn't do that, but I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I'd want to have a fairly, I mean, if it's a friend of mine or a client, I'd want to really have a lengthy conversation about what that is doing for them personally and socially and how is it affecting them psychologically, but I wouldn't just patently say don't do it.
Well, and I think the whole premise behind intimacy, I mean, so obviously we know the reason why people have sex is to have babies and keep the race and the world going. But at the same time, it's driven by this notion of love, where when, you are in love with real love doesn't cause suffering, right? Like real love doesn't make you suffer. And so if you are engaging in different sexual practices with your partner and you're not okay with it, you can speak up about that, and you should speak up about that, because pleasure is something that can be viewed as coming outside of you versus joy is something that's inside of you. And if you are not safe and you're not comfortable and it's painful.
But I think Dave's talking more about if somebody is asking to be degraded or have pain inflicted on them.
I'm not saying about how someone's treating, but how they are treating themselves or want other people to treat them.
And does that change?
I mean, it does, but it also still, I mean, what I said before still stands, obviously. Yeah. But I do see your point where, from my perspective, I guess it's, if you and your partner are on board with that and you have some parameters and very clear guidelines for what you are comfortable and uncomfortable with, then that's, as Frank said, that's their decision. I do think the potential exists for there to be some sort of underlying reason for why they want to feel that pain, why they want to hurt. That could probably be explored more, but it's their choice.
Well, and that's why I'm in those situations. My safe word is Dave Verhagen.
It's everyone's safe word.
Dave Verhagen, Dave Verhagen, Dave Verhagen.
Yeah. It just totally, everyone gets very, they're all done with it at that point once they hear that word.
Well, it's interesting. We're putting pleasure and pain as though they're on opposite ends of a continuum. When you think about so many other aspects of life, we derive positive experiences that involve pain. Exercise and working out, it involves a degree of discomfort and pain. So, controlling or restricting food or other things, there can be an element of pain and discomfort. And so I don't always associate pain being automatically bad or make some, discount it as something either benign or normative. I do think, and I think all of us sort of would be curious, is there some underlying elements that's fueling that, that fetish, that compulsive type of behavior? But when we think about what people can be stimulated by, control or absence of control, right? That dominant submission dynamic, what is it sort of compensating or providing that other aspects of their life is in deficit? So I tend to look at non-normative sexual behaviors on a larger sort of continuum of what's going on in their life and what their story is.
Mm-hmm. And pain is a subjective experience. So
yeah.
And I'm glad you made that distinction, because I think the way I'd answer that question would be pain, okay, but degradation, because those are, I find it very hard to make an argument that being degraded, even at your own choice, is a psychologically healthy thing. I just find that I could buy the argument that someone could find some arousal in pain. It's sort of, it's like that kind of like adrenaline rush, and it's the whole, like, how far is this going to go? I get that. But degradation is a different thing, it feels like. I just don't, maybe someone could make the argument. It just doesn't seem like a healthy thing.
I tend to agree for the most part, but there is something about feeling vulnerable that can be a huge component to intimacy and connection. Mm-hmm. And so it probably goes back to some degree of attachment. Now, whether they have a secure attachment or not. But I also think something that oftentimes people just overlook with fetishes is that people, their baseline, they have different levels of sex drive. They have different levels of testosterone and sexual hormones. And oftentimes you sometimes need these external stimuli to help activate what they already have as a more muted or flat sexual drive. And so for them, it is normative because their default setting is very low sex drive, or just their body in and of itself does not really activate high arousal levels.
Yeah, I could get that. I could get how a person could get there. It still wouldn't. I still would have a hard time buying that would be a healthy thing for them. Right. Like I get that how they could arrive at that spot, but that it's like, okay, well, that's fine. They're being degraded sexually and personally, and that's okay. That just seems that. And I think we're all agreeing we're not trying to pass judgment on what people do in their own sex lives and the privacy of their
own dungeon is up to them.
Their own sex dungeon is up to them, but more of just like we're talking about the psychological health of these things. That feels like the one piece of it that I would be like, yeah, I could get like someone having a fetish with clothing or something. It feels like it is what it is, maybe benign. This other thing feels a little different to me.
And I feel like there's a million things like we could continue to talk about with this. So I wish we had more time, but like just to challenge and play devil's advocate, because I'm not disagreeing with what you say. At the same time, though, why is self-deprecating humor okay then? Just as a thought,
or
right?
Roasting, right?
Right. So we use these means to create a different emotional experience. And I don't know if that's to just create more intense feelings and then that changes the dynamics that you have with someone. I don't know. But just to play devil's advocate, I think whenever it comes to sex, people are very uncomfortable with things that are not within a particular box, that aren't within the social norms and parameters. So.
Well, I think it's a great point you made. But what I would say to that, though, is I would say, we all use a little bit of self-deprecating humor on this panel. And I would say to a point that's actually fun and fine and healthy. But there could be a point where someone was being so self-deprecating with their humor that it would be unhealthy. Like I would say
Absolutely.
There's a line where so I think a similar thing sexually could be true is like if there's a being called a name or something like that's sort of a minor degradation. Okay. But it feels like when it gets to be this thing where it's like it more reflects an unhealthy view of themselves than it does this is just because I don't want to say every expression of sexuality is healthy, because I don't know that that's true. I think there could be things that for a person might reflect a very bad sense of self or something that would be harmful to other people or things like that. Yeah. Last call. Any other thoughts about this, this topic of fetishes?
I mean, in my clinical work, any topic around sex is one of the most difficult and uncomfortable things for a client to come in and talk about. And more often than not, they're not talking about it with their significant other or their partner. And they just have all of these either turn-ons or guilt and shame, and they don't know what to make sense of it. So, for our audience listening to us, if you think that we're being a little too tolerant or accommodating, like the number one thing not the number one thing, one of the most important things in our work is we have to come from a place of non-judgment and safety, that these people need to feel like they can open up and talk about the things that they have deep shame and guilt and conflict and confusion about, and that we're not going to immediately confirm all of their greatest fears about opening up and being honest with somebody.
Right. And our role is to help them understand too, though, that it's okay to have boundaries for your own physical needs, your emotional needs, and to create an opportunity to teach them how do you do that? How do you set a healthy boundary?
Yeah. One thing that's interesting too, I think in the age of internet, social media, where so much of this stuff is talked about and presented and accessible, one thing that I have found in my own practice that's different is, I work mostly with young adult age guys, and I have seen a shift of guys will just come in and just put stuff out there in a way that it might have taken a lot longer for them to feel comfortable to kind of like this, because they're just, their comfort level is higher with talking about it because they've been exposed to other people talking about it. Right. And so in that sense, that could be actually a very positive thing that these things are being talked about. So it opens up the possibility of working out stuff in a more direct way rather than hiding it and feeling shameful about it and that kind of stuff. So that's good. All right, we're going to shift gears. And our final segment is something that we call Doctor's Orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture that we want to recommend to you. Emma Kate.
Well, I spoke a lot about boundaries today. So there's actually a wonderful book called Boundaries. And it is by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. And healthy boundaries are critical to allow you to feel overall, have self-respect, self-esteem, providing physical protection, emotional protection. So being assertive is okay, but there are healthy and more appropriate ways to go about it. So we should all learn how to have boundaries.
And Frank.
There's a documentary called Tell Me Who I Am, which blew my mind.
It's a good one.
It's incredible. The brief synopsis is twins, identical twins, at age 18, I believe. One was in a motorcycle accident and lost all of his memories except for the knowledge of his twin. And they spent the rest of their lives trying to reconstruct memories, but there is a very big secret that is revealed toward the end, and I did not see that coming.
A good
Tell
one.
me who I am.
Yep, it's intense. Jonathan.
There is a new album by Michael Kiwanuka. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The album title is Kiwanuka, and he is an English kind of soulful folk singer-songwriter, and it is a wonderfully rich, challenging album. It harkens back to some of the late 60s, early 70s sounds of Motown and soulful protest, but it's just very creative. I highly recommend you check it out. Michael Kiwanuka. The album is Kiwanuka.
I'm going to recommend the HBO series Silicon Valley, and it's a super funny show. It's one of the few sitcoms that I really, really like, but very funny show and highly recommend it. Silicon Valley. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. For Emma Kate Wright, Frank Gaskell, and Jonathan Hederley in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.